Good evening, good evening, good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Deborah Jenkins, your host for Black Talk Platform, where we discuss everything that concerns the Black community. We started this wonderful, wonderful journey in May of this year. There was so much happening in our community. Um, And I felt as if we needed an outlet to come together to discuss things that were happening to us, that continue to happen to us. But I didn't want it to only be a response to crime and violence. Um, I also wanted to add value in a way that we're able to take decisive action in our response to um, different external and internal stimuli. We are all under the same conditions as a result of the pandemic, but yet Black lives are still being assaulted. Um, to be sure, my program has almost entirely focused upon the assault on Black bodies from outside of our community. Good evening, Minister Blanchard. You know I'm always happy to see you because you are definitely a faithful watcher of Black Talk Platform. I was talking about how this show has focused almost entirely on the external assault against Black bodies because I personally see it as a misnomer to call it Black on Black crime, even though that's technically what's happening. I see it in a very spiritual way, unlike the demonic, I guess that's also spiritual way of the external advances against our bodies and our people. And so tonight, I'm doing part one of what I'm calling Law Enforcement for Blacks 101. And the reason why I thought this was important is because often we don't have the correct response always to the assault against Black bodies from law enforcement. We don't understand the origins of the assaults. And often the church will tell us we're going to pray ourselves through this, but no, we need to understand the origins of the assault. We apply prayer in the proper way, and we're not simply praying, not having the correct knowledge. And so that's what I want to do tonight. I want to talk about the origins of law enforcement in the United States. To be sure, it has everything to do with the transatlantic slavery, the imprisonment, the enslavement of our ancestors. And I want to talk about that. And tonight, my special guest is Pastor Frank Jenkins, who is also my husband. He has been talking about the origins for a little while in our discussions at home. And I said, well, you know what? If you could just come on and explain to the people the origins of law enforcement in this nation, then I'll be able to pick up next week when I start talking about a little more localized law enforcement, specifically here in New York. And I want to spend some time talking about the orphanage for colored girls. Now, I spoke about this on an earlier show, or perhaps on my friend's show, her Mental Health Mondays, Minister Tandra Burkett. She's an educational activist, and she and I we shared some time on her show over the summer. And I truly want us as a community to be educated so that we won't be simply reactionary, as my sister said yesterday to me. But she wasn't talking about me, but she was saying we are reactionary people. Hello, Detective. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I'm glad you joined us, and I would love for you to add to the discussion as my husband and I get into it. If you feel led to, certainly, I would love to share with everyone the origins of law enforcement in this country. So, my sister said, so often we are reactionary instead of responding, and so I believe just taking from her notebook. I would say that if we have more information about the origins of law enforcement in this country, we will be better suited to respond to it. And so I'm going to welcome now my husband, Pastor Frank Jenkins, to Black Talk platform for the first time. Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. How
Awesome.
about you?
Awesome. I'm good. And yes, we're in the same house, y'all, but we're certainly in a different room. But I'm so happy to have you on tonight. I have Minister Delilah Blanchard. Minister, I'm pretty sure you remember him. He may not remember you because I've run him all over the place in ministry. But Minister Delilah Blanchard is one of our sisters from Walk Memorial, but she's no longer there. She's now with Gethsemane. Correct me, but also a partner in this justice work in terms of the NYPD is also viewing tonight, and that's Detective Muhammad Amen. And so we're happy to have him, and I just invited him to share any comments as we go along in the discussion. So you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself? Would you like to?
Yes, I could. Um, well, I'm here. As was stated, I am the husband of our host, and I'm happy to be on tonight. And hopefully, I can add something that we all can learn from.
Excellent, excellent. So let's sort of get into it. So I was teeing up the conversation by telling them how you and we often discuss law enforcement. But I'm be honest with you guys. Everybody who knows me, I'm like Spitfire. I'm ready. I'm gone. I'm gone. So it was great for my sister to say to me yesterday, we have to stop being so reactionary. We have to respond. And so I'd asked my husband to come on and share with us from his perspective last week. So it's like both bookends. He's going to come with the academic knowledge about the origins of law enforcement in this country, while my sister's telling me to that we all should be more responsive than reactionary. So I would like to ask you, can you share with us, through your research, the origins of law enforcement in the United States? I think it's important.
Well, all right. I mean, the origins of law enforcement in the United States were really based primarily on the protection of property. That was what it was for.
While my sister's telling me to that we
It's okay.
all should. I would like to ask you. Go on. Can you share with
Okay.
us?
And so the protection of property, and that was the main ideal, the main goal here. It was about private property or property that was owned by corporations. They wanted to make sure that their property could be maintained and kept, and control kept around the ownership of property, and make sure that property would not be taken or damaged in any way. In the North, that came in the form of, basically a volunteer police force. And eventually that evolved into a more public police force because those who had interests in economic interests convinced the rest of the people that it was in their best interest that property be preserved. And eventually we had the first modern, well, not modern, but the first police forces in cities in the North, in cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia. In the South, however, there was uh, a much different understanding, a much different ideal in terms of the creation of the police force. In the South, the economics that drove the creation of police forces didn't center on the protection of shipping interests or things like that, but it was on the preservation of slavery. There's a scholarly uh, take has been done on this by a gentleman named Gary Potter, who said that who says that in the earliest slave patrols came in the colonies in year 1704.
Mm-hmm.
And so so the slave patrols were tasked with chasing down runaways and or preventing revolts. And so these are the origins of our modern day police forces, and there is a direct tie to the slave patrols and the control of black bodies
Hmm.
as to the way that policing is understood and done even to this day.
Okay. So if I'm correct in what I heard, in the northern part of the country, like New York, Pennsylvania, places such as that, Boston, Massachusetts, the northern states were more concerned about the protection or the preservation of property, whereas in the southern states, it was more about maintaining slavery. Am I correct?
Right. Well, let me just be absolutely clear. Uh, it was property either way. Our ancestors were considered property, and whether it was in the North or the South. But the impetus for creating the slave, I'm sorry, the police forces was slightly different between North and South. Primarily in the North, they were trying to protect shipping interests. They wanted to make sure that goods got off the ships and got to where they were supposed to go. But in the South, it was more about because of the number of slaves. Now, of course, there were slaves in the North and slaves in the South, and there were also free people of color all throughout this country. But the 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 necessity to control black bodies in the South, where there were so much more of us, especially in comparison to the number of white citizens, there needed to be a slave patrol in the South in order to control black bodies, to put down revolts, and so on and so forth.
Okay. So I'm glad you got that shared with us. Minister Blanchard, please let me know if that echo is still there. I've tried to shut down everything. Just let me know if you still hear the echo. All right. So the control of black bodies. Did you all hear the year that Pastor Jenkins shared with us? He shared with us in the 1700s. The author Gary Potter has written about this, and I was reading earlier just to get ready for this, the same time frame. So this was almost 200 years before the so-called emancipation in the 1700s, that there was this fear of uprisings and revolts by slave owners. And what I read today, and I don't know if this is something that you would have also shared, or is that they just deputized regular old Joe Blow white man to search and hunt our ancestors down, those who they suspected would try to break free. And this is the brutality that we see today goes back that far.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, you have to. When you think of the fugitive slave laws, that codified the idea that any person, black or white, if they were standing there and a slave ran past them and the slave patrol was chasing them, they could be deputized and would be obligated under law to help the slave catchers catch that person. And it didn't matter if the person was actually a free person of color. They just simply, if they decided you were a slave, you ended up being hunted down by the slave patrol.
Yeah. And it's incredible to me because I've been following Until Freedom, and the great work of activism on the ground that they've been doing along with the local activists in Louisville, and watching as they report back to us to let us know what's going on there. And a very similar situation is happening out there. I've heard that they have been patrolled by drones as they march to peacefully protest, while there are white vigilante groups, they are not law enforcement at all, are there in surrounding them, going and trying to intimidate the churches that have designated themselves as sanctuaries for the organizers and activists in Louisville and those who've come in from other places. So they're being surveillanced by the Louisville Metropolitan Police, LMPD, overhead by drones and on the ground. The pictures are out there. I'm not making it up. But also, they're patrolling them in churches. Churches have always been known as sacred spaces, but they're being patrolled, they're being surveillance, they are being intimidated by law enforcement in Louisville while they allow these white vigilante racist groups to patrol around, because Kentucky is an open carry state, patrol around gas stations. Now, a couple of things come to mind with that. You have live ammunition at a gas station. So they're not very smart. But the, the point I'm trying to make is that they're being allowed to quote unquote protect this property as if the activists want to blow themselves up by vandalizing service stations. And it's really appalling, but it certainly reminds me of what you just explained and what you just described here in terms of the origins. And the reason why I thought this was so important, Frank, is that we do react, like Juanita said, we do react. We need to be armed with the information. This stuff doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Someone has actually studied it, just like the author you stated, Gary Potter, but others have studied it too. And would you pick up on that in terms of how you see the origins as you've described them playing out today, apart from the example I just gave?
Well, again, quoting Gary Potter, during the Civil War, most of the policing was done by the military. But as Reconstruction came to an end, many local sheriffs functioned in a way analogous to the earlier slave patrols. They simply were enforcing segregation and the disenfranchisement of freed slaves. And so the point was at all times to control Black bodies. Now, of course, they always couch it in the terms of protecting property. That's what this young man said, this 17-year-old who killed two people and almost killed another. He said he was going out there to protect property. And so this has always been what they've couched it under, and they call it the protection of property, but really what it's about is controlling the Black populace and making sure that they don't that there's never an uprising amongst the slaves or former slaves. The other thing I would say is that lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, but when it comes to protecting property, remember we were the property, and so that is the full understanding. That is the seminal understanding of what we talk about when we're talking about policing Black people.
We were the property. And I think in a lot of ways, that same sentiment remains, because when you think about the NBA, when you think about the NFL, and how the NFL in particular was weaponized against peaceful protest by the person who we'll all be tuning in to hear his debate with Vice President Joe Biden very soon. But I know the young man who was one of your campers when he was young, but he's a former NBA player, I believe. What's his name?
Thomas.
Etan Thomas, and he made me aware of not referring to the so-called owners of the NFL and NBA as owners, but as CEOs. Is that how he refers to them?
Yes, that is what he says. Yes,
because we have to, and that's a piece of education as well. We have to transform our minds from the way we have been conditioned to think about things. And he was on one of the news programs and he explained why he says that, because we're not owned by people, but there's so many ways that ownership of Black bodies and brown bodies still exists. In the state of Mississippi, where I've been doing a lot of work for the last 2.5, almost 3 years, they're still using the federal minimum wage. So is a lot of different states, and no one can raise a family on $7 and what is it, 25 cents an hour, $7.45 an hour, wherever it is. You cannot raise a family. You cannot even take care of yourself on that. So there are a lot of ownership type relationships that we are still bound by, even though it's not chattel slavery in this country. And that sort of leads me to my second question of you. How do you see the slave patrols overlapping with the black codes? And I don't know if everyone is aware of what black codes are, but if you could share that with us, we'd appreciate it.
Well, yes, that leads us right back to what I was talking about just before. Once the Civil War happened, and African American people, or slavery, I should say, is abolished in this country. Now, I say that carefully because the abolishment of slavery was only for those who were not found guilty of and convicted of a crime. And so another way of controlling black bodies and maintaining the system of slavery was to create uh, what was called the black codes, where you could be arrested just for standing on the street corner,
Right,
just for being out in public. And
right.
so once you're arrested and put and quote unquote duly convicted, now you can be leased out to the same owners, the same plantations, the same corporations that had you in slavery just before the Civil War. And so these black codes were enlisted, in particular in the South, but we all know that phrase, up South.
Right.
So they love to bring down South, up South. And so
Hmm.
this became pervasive throughout the country, so that the policing, our modern day policing, at least in terms of the way it relates to African American people in this nation, is born in the early slave patrols. It wasn't, like I said earlier, in the northern cities, it was more about protecting shipping and hard goods, but
Hmm.
eventually that the same mentality, the same understanding became a direct tie to modern day policing, to the early slave controls, at least as it relates to African American people, because of the slave codes, which could find you on the wrong side of the law simply for being out in public.
Sort of reminds you of the broken windows policies here in New York City, and even stop and frisk in New York City. Those type of things sort of tie into the black codes, because I think there was just so much anger over the abolition of slavery that there was an intent to continue to make us feel criminalized. And certainly our ancestors did feel criminalized because they were not allowed to freely marry. They had to ask permission from their slave holders, or um I, I'm trying to use Brother Thomas's language because I'm so resentful. I am very resentful of the enslavement of our ancestors, that it's really hard for me to call them slave owners. But I'm not so dumb as to try to redact history and say that it was a mutually beneficial relationship, as some historians who are trying to write our children's textbooks are now trying to do. So, whew, with the black codes, they led in the black codes led into Jim Crow,
Yes.
and they let Jim Crow had to be done away with, and it led to the civil rights movement. We saw uprisings in Detroit, we saw uprisings in Watts, in Chicago, all Philadelphia, all the major cities, in this fight for liberation from Jim Crowism. And I want to bring that out only because I think people think or believe that Dr. King's nonviolent movement was the only righteous movement. And I disagree. I think I revere the work the body of work he did. But I've always been more of a Malcolm type person, as opposed to a Dr. King type person in terms of nonviolence. And I think there's some biblical support for that. And I won't get into a theological discourse around that, but I just wanted to share that that wasn't the only movement. And we know that there were a lot of Blacks who didn't just simply accept the harm and assault on them. That's where we find ourselves today in a lot of ways. You see young people who I'm very proud to see leading these movements for justice in 2020. And I hear them rejecting past ways of liberation while they pay homage to all who came before, whether it was Malcolm, whether it was Martin, whether it was Stokely Carmichael or any other. They pay homage to them, but they're doing it their way. Do you think that and then this was not a question I asked you to prepare for, but do you think that this is something that you could support the way they're doing it? I mean, I'm not saying, well, this is the way I would do it, and they're not doing it. Do you support their approach to the fight for justice?
Well, what I would say is this: even Dr. King was not in favor, or I guess what the best way to say this is, Dr. King believed in personal protection. All right, he didn't think that people just simply had to be sitting ducks waiting for others to come and murder them in their own homes. That was never his intent. What he believed in was capturing the moral high ground in public, so that when the cameras were on, the people would see the kind of brutality that was taking place in many of these southern cities, because many people dismissed it. They said, "Oh no, that's not that can't be right. That's not real. People wouldn't behave that way." But as Dr. King captured he was really ahead of his time in terms of knowing how to use the media, that new medium of television, in
Mm-hmm.
order to capture people behaving in the way that they had been, because of the early history of this country. I mean, when you have to remember that this country was born in the sin of genocide and shaped in the iniquity of slavery.
Yes.
And so when you have those kinds of pathologies running through your body politic, it's impossible to really be able to behave in a sane manner without ever having dealt with them. So Dr. King wanted to bring those things to light. Now, as far as the young people are concerned today, I've always been more of a utilitarian type. I believe that what works is what we should pursue in terms of how we're able to move forward. We do need to continue to create new tactics in the overall overarching strategy of freedom and equality under the law. Because what we have to realize is that they came up with the slave patrol for a purpose. The purpose
Okay.
was to maintain their property.
Right.
And it doesn't matter how many and so what I'm saying is, they never stopped and have never stopped trying to maintain their property, maintain their advantages. And so, as whatever ways that we develop in order to counter those, they are going to, in the reactionary way that they do, they will react and create new ways and new forms of oppression. It's the same thing. In other words, just as I believe modern day policing evolved from the slave patrols, and in exactly the same way that the black codes evolved from slavery, in the same way we've had an evolution of the reactionary processes, in which people are still the levels of oppression are still maintained to this day. So as we continue to come up with new ways in order to create a more equitable society, those who have a stake in continuing and maintaining inequality are going to continue to create new ways in order to come to that means and come to that conclusion. So yes, we do have to, I do support the young people, and I do believe that we can't continue to use the same tactics as others, as those that are in opposition to us are constantly evolving their tactics.
That is a really good point. I don't know if everybody heard or understood him, but he said we cannot continue to use the same tactics as those who are assaulting us continue to evolve in the use of theirs. Um, I often tell our kids that, I see so much in social media because I sort of go through all of them. I don't just post all day. I do have our businesses and stuff. And so I'm on Twitter. Twitter is like a whole nother beast, but then there's Instagram, and of course there's Facebook. These are the three major social media platforms. And what I see, I don't even share with them immediately, or even with you and my mother and my sisters, because it's just so much happening out there. And I'm glad that you too support the young people. And I've said this before. I think the last time I said this in public was when we did the public I don't it wasn't a march, it wasn't a rally, it was a gathering after Philando Castile was murdered. I said to the young people who were there that your ways don't have to be my ways, but I will support you, because I think too often our age group and those even older than us want to limit what younger people are doing, and they're saying they're not even asking us. uh, either we're with them or we're not. They're going to go forward, but they actually need us. They need us for financial support. They need us for housing support. They need us for food and those type of things. But I think it has come a time. It has come to a time where we have to trust their methodologies, because, as you said, it won't theirs won't be ours. I want to take, because we're at the half hour, I want to take this minute to ask those of you who are praying people out there, and who still hold out hope for law enforcement, to pray for Sergeant Javier Esqueda. I posted this a few days ago about Sergeant Esqueda. He was a brave soul. I'll put it like that. He was a brave soul. He came and shared a video of some of his colleagues, his fellow officers, in a small town outside of Chicago. A video of these officers brutalizing, brutalizing a 37-year-old man. And let me just parenthetically say this. I don't know and can't say that they didn't have a good reason to have come into this man's presence. It was a drug related stop, but apparently the young man was having an overdose, was overdosing, and they claim, but they're on video. So the claim in public is not what actually happened. And so we thank Sergeant Javier Esqueda. They claimed that they didn't want him to swallow his tongue as he was ODing on fentanyl or whatever other drugs he may have been using. But they didn't put the billy club across like this to keep him from swallowing his tongue. They put the billy club, or the nightstick, I don't know the proper term, but they put the billy club down his throat. And if that wasn't enough, they held his nose, and he died. And he died. So Sergeant Javier Esquerra came forward and leaked this video, this horrid video. They had been taunting him and calling him names prior to murdering him. And as a result, this is how the police department thanked this 27-year veteran, Sergeant Esqueda. They immediately took his shield and his gun and they put him on desk duty and started an internal affairs investigation into him. And this is what I believe, Frank, that you're saying. I think that you're trying to tell us that we can't only see with our eyes. We have to go a little deeper and see what's happening behind the scenes because these things are happening and they're becoming a little bit more clever in the way they harm us. Because the intent, oftentimes, especially with these cases that make the news, the intent of these officers really seem not only to be to kill us, but to do it in the most brutal way. And so we have to have enough. Losing him, you got it. We have to have enough information in order to respond in the proper way, which is what Juanita was saying to me before. Let me go to the comments real quick before I wrap it up with Sergeant Esqueda. Thank you. Another frequent viewer, or yes, and that's my friend, our friend Junius Williams. He says, Blacks are the canaries in the coal mine. So all peoples, people, and other people of color should be concerned. And I think he's right. And then he's saying to you, Pastor Frank, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. Is that what you were trying to say? I think so, right? Basically.
Well, yes. I mean, again, like I was saying, we have to be able uh, to switch our tactics as they're needed and as necessary. Um,
Absolutely.
I do believe, though, that we do have to continue to maintain the moral high ground. I mean, and what we have to do is call it out for what it is. Early on in this country, as slavery began to develop, you had white indentured servants and African slaves would oftentimes run away together. And when they were caught, what they as slavery began to be developed as in terms of skin color and ethnicity, what they began to do was they decided that it was better to begin to create differences between the slaves and white indentured servants, so that they began to write into the law that if a black and a white slave ran off together and they were caught, the African slave could be, or servant could be, beaten naked in public. But for the white servant that ran off, that was not allowed. They had to be taken, in private and punished. And so there began to be this kind of separation and this difference between the white folks and black in terms of how public punishment or law enforcement was served, and we see that even today. What do if just right with the drug laws, if a person is caught with cocaine, they get a certain number of years, but if a person is caught with crack, then you get they want to give you forever.
Can we be
So,
clear? You mean if a white person is caught with cocaine?
well, yes, because cocaine in its purest form is
It's a
usually
powder.
only right. It's usually only afforded by those who have the means, and so crack, remember, was a way of getting cocaine to the masses because it was cut several times with other ingredients. But pure cocaine was too expensive for the average everyday user to get, to be able to obtain. And so powder cocaine, of course, was treated differently than the user, or someone caught with powder cocaine was treated differently than someone caught with crack. And that also has its origins in the time of slavery, because they wanted to create and maintain African people as a permanent underclass to whom you could do anything to, and not have to worry about getting in trouble, not have to worry about facing law enforcement because of the fact that we were considered less than human. We weren't given the same treatment for the same crimes as as white people were during those days, and so it created this separation, this imbalance in the way that law enforcement deals with our community as compared to white communities.
Well,
There's a I'm sorry,
go on. Mhm.
uh, one of the scholars I like to listen to. His name is Tim Wise, and he talks about the racial disparities, and he talks about how when he was in college, he never had his trunk popped open and searched by police. And he said if he had, his college career would have been over immediately, because you know the way in which that we are subjected to law enforcement is just completely different than the way young white people are.
Yes, yes. And I haven't seen my friend Carl on Facebook in a little while, because if he had heard you mention Tim Wise, I think he'd be ready to clap back. And but I think when we had a discussion about Tim Wise, he and I a few months ago, I think it emboldened him to become the more authentic anti-racist activist, which he is. They're both Caucasian. But let me go backwards and let's clarify some language here, because we want to make sure that we are not leaving the audience with a conflating of slavery and indentured servants. There were no whites brought over here, stolen and purchased from their homelands, and came over here in chains to serve people who could have very well worked the land that they had actually stolen for themselves. They are not the same. Now, what indentured servants were people who came from other countries, perhaps, but they were white. They were not black. We were not allowed that distinction. And I think it's important that we let the audience know the difference, even if there were indentured slaves indentured servants, rather, white people who decided to tag along with those blacks who were enslaved and tried to get their freedom, even though their freedom was an economic freedom. Ours was full body, soul, and spirit. Is that making sense?
Yes, I mean, but what I want to make sure that we understand, what you understand, what I'm saying is I'm not comparing the two at all. All I'm saying is that capital early on treated everyone in that it was exploiting early on in the same way. It was when capital realized that it was more expedient and more cost effective to begin to create racism as a part, in terms of ethnicity, that we became the target.
Mm-hmm.
Because if a white person runs off, he can blend in with the crowd. Nobody's going to ask him for his papers.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Because
But if
they weren't
one
slaves, because they were not slaves.
right, but what I'm saying is they could blend into the crowd because it was not assumed that they were slaves.
Right.
Well,
Because they
as
weren't.
they right. But what I'm saying, okay, not to get bogged down, but what I'm saying is, as the code, or as it began, like I said, as slavery began to become based on ethnicity, because it's easier to spot a black person in a crowd. It's much easier to track them down if they run away. So that was one of the reasons, and plus, for various other reasons, that they decided to focus on us as their as slaves. But the key to the point is that early on, the punishments for running away were relatively similar. They were the same. But as they began to create racism based on ethnicity, they had to create in the minds of poor white people who would have run away with slaves in order to get away from the exploitation and excesses of capitalism. They began to plant in their minds the seed that even though I'm just as poor as him, at least I'm not them. I'm better in some way. And so that begins to creep into the mindset and creates and establishes the mindset where the enslavement and the mistreatment of other people could be palliated and be and taken in and accepted by the mainstream culture. It
Hmm.
doesn't happen without that. You have to be able to dehumanize before people will accept that, even if it is someone of a different phenotype, a different color, a different ethnicity.
It's interesting. That really is also a good way to sort of set up what I'm going to do next week when I talk about the orphanage for colored girls, because while there's no conflating at all, there's no confusion after the civil wars end and um, the organization of law enforcement as it was then, as it has evolved now, there was this great fear that is at the heart of racism. Um, and racism is only for those who have power over others. My ancestors, your ancestors, had no power over the thieves that stole them and brought them from their land. And so the racism was never against white bodies, because from the very beginning they didn't make them slaves, they made them indentured servants, those who could buy their way into a different strata, a different class of whiteness in this country. And so I you know me, you know, we have these conversations all the time. I'm not going to ever just leave that language out there where the two seem so closely related and that the problems are the same, because I've said this. I've taught urban planning and policy at College of New Rochelle years ago, and when I talked about stratification, I talked about how a white brother, a white person rather, who has worked and lived in the mountains and the hills of Kentucky and or West Virginia, and they can come out and decide, I want to go to the big city, when all they've known all their lives is working in a coal mine. They're simple people, you know, and I don't mean intellectually simple. I mean, they live simple lives, but all of a sudden they want to come down out of the mountains into the city. All they have to do is get that coal dust from under their nails, clean up, cut that hair, coif it, or whatever, make it more palatable for Wall Street, Fifth Avenue, Madison Avenue, Park Avenue. They come on down here when you have been toiling all your life to get to a point where you could be interviewed on Wall Street, Park Avenue, Madison Avenue, Fifth Avenue. And the young man who grew up in the hills and the mountains of West Virginia and Kentucky, because he's Caucasian, can come down here and get the job that your whole life you've been preparing for, simply because of his skin. And so that's why I will never put the two together. There may have been um some cohesiveness in terms of let's get out of this place, but truly, our ancestors, the risk was far greater, and not just about a public beating versus one that's done behind the shed, but the risk was one that was to life and limb, and that was not the case with so-called indentured servants, from my knowledge. And so when we talk about the colored girls orphanage and what they did to them, because they feared that blacks would become dominant or even get one or two positions in New York's police department, what they did. And it's for those who I keep sharing it because I am going to talk about it next week. But if there are those of you who want to go and get a head start on the conversation next week, you will be appalled at what they did. And when you see some of the things that happen, not only in New York, but New York, as we all know, has the largest police department in the world. And so as New York goes, the rest try to follow. And while LAPD, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, I've never lived in LA. The LAPD has been, and Frank, you can tell me what your thoughts are if you have thoughts about this. LAPD is in so many ways worse than the NYPD that I've known. Yeah, and I'm not talking about the work that I do with them. I'm talking about the history, the more recent history, say back from the 80s and coming forward. What do you think? Do you think the LAPD is worse for blacks or has
Um, well, it's hard for me to say because I've never lived there, never been there. Um, but what we've heard, definitely, and what we've witnessed in terms of the Rodney King situation has always, we've always felt like that the police force out there, it has been particularly brutal. But what we have to remember is that the brutality that is inflicted on black bodies in terms both institutionally and in private, by private citizens, comes out of a great fear that they have of being replaced or
yes. Yeah.
displaced. And it's an irrational fear, first of all, because it's a fear that's based on, what do we make up, 13% of the population, but somehow we're going to, we're going to displace all of them in some way. So it's really irrational. And again, what I think we have to realize is that the entire pathology, the phobias, the fears, the irrationality has been built up over all these years because capitalism has to have a a permanent underclass, no matter
Mhm.
where it is, no matter what country it's in. Here in the United States or in America, what became the United States, they had uh, what's the word? Just the a simple way of developing that permanent underclass, and it was through ethnicity.
Mhm.
And even though we understand that racism uh, affects all of us, there was a recent study, I think Citibank put it out, and it said that the United States has GDP or what have you has lost $16 trillion based simply on racism. Now imagine how far that $16 trillion could have gone in terms of creating new schools, creating new jobs, creating whatever it is that could have that could make our society much better and work much better. But the problem is, for so many, they would rather lose the 16 trillion than have to, make common cause with those that they've come to learn to hate. So remember, racism is the power to affect someone's life negatively based on your own personal prejudice. But racism does not exist without prejudice because you have to have a certain number or a certain level, a certain percentage of people who believe in the same way so that they will allow racism to exist.
Right.
Racism can't exist unless you have enough prejudice. Without
And there
prejudice, racism can't exist. And so
and
that,
there's okay, go on.
mhm.
Go on.
I was going to say, and so that's why early on you find that the penalties for the same infraction against black bodies, as you stated, was far more severe than it was for white bodies because the intent was to create prejudice.
So the intent may have been to create prejudice, but they already had a hatred for us, and that hatred exists today. It never ended. I was watching the documentary, and I think I shared with you. Did I share with you that I was watching Stacey Abrams' documentary called All In, The Fight for Our Democracy, and it's airing right now on Amazon. And I watched, it was all about the vote in 2018. She was very, very closely running with their current governor. His name escapes me right now. But she went in, all the cameras were with her. She went to do early voting. And sure enough, when she got up there, they told her, I'm sorry, ma'am, you can't vote because you've already requested an absentee ballot. And she says, well, I've been voting since 1992 in person. I've never requested an absentee ballot. And I guess because the cameras were there, that's what she deduced anyway. Because the cameras were there, the young lady had to go and get her supervisor, and they straightened everything out. But it took some time. So when the actual her opponent, who is now the governor, actually when he went in to vote, he had to try it 15 times, I believe they said, before his ballot could be taken. Now, mind you, he was the Secretary of State. He was the one who changed every law to disenfranchise Black voters in particular in the state of Georgia. What I'm bringing this up to say about racism is that he was being interviewed by a foreign news reporter. I don't even know. I don't remember if they were even identified, but the reporter said to him, how do you feel being responsible for disenfranchising 100,000 or 150,000 people from exercising their right to vote? And he says, well, I totally disagree with you. You don't even know, blah, blah. He got into a little back and forth with him. But what I noticed what was going on behind him. And it was his daughter agreeing with everything her dad was saying. And the reality is the reason he had trouble voting is because of how he changed the laws in the state of Georgia to essentially fix the race for himself, because they were so closely tied. I think it was a matter of 17,000 votes. So now if he hadn't disenfranchised 100,000 or 150,000 people, we could have the first they could have Georgia, the state of Georgia could have the first African American and African American woman as governor now. But because of the way he worked hard as Secretary of State to change the laws, and the point I'm making is his daughter at the time was only 16. She's not his only child, but she was the one who was right there. You know, our children, we have two kids. My kids, we were getting off the elevator one day with COVID, and I had my mask on, and a neighbor, I said hi to the neighbor as I was leaving, but our daughter said, Mom, he didn't think you spoke to him. So what I did is immediately reached out to someone who we both know, and I said, I don't have his number. Please let him know I didn't just snub him. You know how we're having a hard time recognizing people behind these masks. But he spoke, I spoke, but he didn't hear me speak. What I'm saying is that our daughter called me because she didn't know that I had spoken either. So what did I do? She did not stand with me in not speaking. And it happens to be one of our Caucasian neighbors. She did not stand with me because she was standing on the side of right. I'm saying racists raise their children to be racist, because this 16-year-old, knowing, probably having overheard some of the conversations late at night, I don't know, but she was agreeing with her father that he didn't disenfranchise anybody. It was being talked about. And it was not like my dad would never do such a thing. It was not that expression. Just watch the video, just watch the documentary, and you will see. And that was just an example, a more recent example. We have videos out there, 7-year-olds calling Black men the N-word and stuff. Racist raised racist. Decent people raise decent children who will not agree with their parent when they think that they're in the wrong. They will call them and say, Mom, you didn't speak to him and that wasn't right, even though they may be wrong and mistaken. So I'm not giving cover for racist being racist against Black people, my people, or Latinos. Their greatest fear, as you said, is that we would take over. We definitely have the intellectual ability, we always have, which is why so often everything that we've ever done has been stolen. But aside from that, I think their greatest fear is that Blacks and Latinos would get together. They see their numbers dwindling, they are getting older, and it is really a sad commentary on human life that you could be so hateful towards another group of people who you desire to take from and take from and take from. So I give racists no cover. It's not just about economics. It is a root of it. Racism doesn't equate to prejudice, because I have my prejudices also. I don't like certain music, I am actually prejudiced against some music, um, and the people also who put it out, but it's not the same as racism. That becomes more of a preference, especially in these times that we're living. Anyway, I went on that diatribe just to do that example of racism. Pastor Frank, I'm going to give you the last word for this conversation. Would you share with us how do you see us proceeding? And we're going to go over a couple of minutes, but that's okay, just a couple of minutes, because everybody wants to get to that debate that's coming up in an hour. Why don't you share with us some more about your aspirations for your children, for yourself, or for our community? However you want to wrap it up, the floor is yours.
Well, I think that as long as the United States holds on to its its ties, as long as those ties are still there to its to those original sins of genocide and slavery.
What happened? Can't hear you. We
And so,
can't hear you. Okay.
in terms of I am with those who say we need to abolish the police. Now, or defund the police. Now, when I say that, of course, I don't say all of y'all, you're fired, go home, you don't have a job. But what I mean by that is, I believe that we need to sever all ties to the racism that has brought this country to where it is now, and sever those ties and create something new, so that we can move forward without that albatross of racism hanging around our necks and over our head, so that we can create the kind of society free of the prejudices and the racism that have been so pervasive here in this country in which we live. So I believe we need to begin to sever those ties, and because of the fact that police and first responders in general are so held in such reverence until it's time to pay them, are held in such reverence in this country, we could make the difference could be overwhelming that could be made if we can find a way to recreate, reimagine the way in which policing is done in this country. It needs to move from the old slave patrol. It needs to move from the
Absolutely.
inconsistent uh, application of the law, and it needs to move toward an equitable and equality under and equal protection under the law. Until we do that, the racism, the prejudice, the prejudice could be there. But if we sever the ties to racism, then it doesn't matter who's prejudiced. I don't care who don't like me. But as long as you're not allowed under the law to treat me differently because you don't like me, well, then that's the goal I believe we should be striving for, because I want for my children the same thing that anybody wants for their children, which is for
Right.
them to be able to reach the fullness of their potential.
Absolutely. Thank you. I don't, I appreciate that. Just for the record, I'm going to say, and I wasn't sure if you said this or not, I am so for reimagining and reinventing law enforcement as we know it. I think it's really, it's not about just moving, say, like in New York City, $1 billion from the NYPD's budget to to outfit housing projects with broadband. That should have already have happened. You know, so I think we need a little bit more imagination than something like that. I do agree. I don't agree with the whole phrase of defund the police. That's what's gotten us still discussing those type of measures. But I do agree that we should do something different. I know, like the NYPD, they announced at the beginning, even before COVID began, they had announced, the commissioner had announced that he was going to do some focusing on young people. So he, like we have NCO officers, he instituted the YCO officers, the youth coordinating officers. This is back in January when he first was appointed, but they've moved forward with it. And what we heard from the commissioner, who I believe is over it, is that they asked them all for resignations, all of the youth officers, because each precinct had youth officers. They asked them all for resignations. They had to reapply. These are the type of reimagining things that I like, because what it does, it sort of weeds out those who don't really want to be there. Some people get stuck with those type of details and they really don't want to be there. Well, we don't, if you don't have patience for all that young people go through because you've forgotten that you were a young person, then yes, turn in your resignation. We're going to re-interview you. And if this is not a good fit, you're not going to be there. So I do like that. I'm not sure if that's going on all across the board with the NYPD or elsewhere, but I rather prefer reimagining policing rather than defund policing, because as someone who I spoke to who's in elected office in the Bronx said, and I agree with that person, said that, when people like a Jane Fonda, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago also, when people like Jane Fonda, yeah, you've been an ally for years, talk about defund the police, but when was the last time you walked in the hood? When was the last time you were in the community? We don't want our police gone. Because the way the society is right now, we still need a level of protection, but we do want to be a part of how it's done. And the way it is now, it doesn't work for our community because too many Black and brown bodies are being harmed. And so definitely there needs to be a reimagining. But defund the police, a bad phrase. I don't know where it came from, but it's caused the delay in actual change occurring. So listen, thank you, Pastor Frank, for being here with me tonight. I really appreciate it. I think you got us thinking about the origins of law enforcement from all the way back with the slave patrols, bringing it forward to the Black codes, Jim Crow, and where we are today. And I'm believing that even in the midst of the fight that we must continue to involve ourselves in. I posted something from Bernice King the other day. She said, if you're not a part of trying to seek justice, then stop calling for peace. And I love that, because too many armchair thinkers are telling people like myself who are out there on these front lines for justice, and not just for our family, but for all families, all Black people, all Latinos, Native Americans, and anyone else. And I always use these three groups because we are the ones most harmed and have been most harmed in this country. And also our Muslim brothers and sisters, who, whatever they may be, wherever they may have come from. But we need people who don't ask for us a peace that's not sustainable, but are a part of the peace. And so I appreciate you being here tonight, and we look forward to having you on again in the future. Join me here again next week at 7 p.m. When I'll be talking about the Colored Girls Orphanage right here in New York. And I will show you pictures. I will show you why this atrocity took place at the hands of those who would become our modern day police. God bless you all. I'm pretty sure everybody's going to be watching the debate tonight. If nothing else, it may be a B movie, but get your popcorn ready so you all have something to talk about tomorrow. And I know you're going to fall into your camps where the president won, where the vice president won. It really doesn't matter. What matters most is that you exercise your vote on November 3rd, or better yet, if you're able to exercise your vote prior to the 3rd, the sooner the better. We've received a report today. Everybody has received it by now. That is a huge impropriety going on with ballots being sent out in New York. They're not, the names are not matching the addresses. And if you respond or you use a ballot that has the wrong address, your vote is not going to be counted. Please, you don't have to wait. A friend who's not on here tonight, she usually is, she said that you can check at vote.org org, I believe, to see, or the county board of elections, to see if they received your request for an absentee ballot, and if not, request it again, and they will get it out to you. So exercise your vote. Our ancestors died for it, and we should honor them by voting on November 3rd. God bless you, and I thank you all for being here again tonight. Peace, and I thank Pastor Frank Jenkins for being my guest. God bless you all.